Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 730 for October 7th, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
The best thing about it was being able to produce really good whiskey. Now that I was able to drink what I made has probably been the biggest thrill I've ever had, because when OKI came out and I started working with them, I was now able to drink the best bourbon that I think was out there, which was made in Indiana, where I could never get it before because it was always blended away.
Larry Ebersold spends his time consulting with distillers around the U.S. these days. He's worked with Sagamore Spirit, New Riff, Boone County, Rabbit Hole, and other startups over the last few years. But he spent most of his career at a little distillery on the banks of the Ohio River in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. Today, that little distillery is known as MGP, and frankly, it's not so little. I was there for a visit earlier this week, but back when Larry was running the place as master distiller, it was still known as the Seagram's Distillery, and later as LDI. He retired in 2010, just before it was sold to MGP. Larry will share some of his stories with us later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's coming up later on, along with the calendar of events, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, and on Behind the Label, we'll talk with one of Larry's successors in Lawrenceburg. It's all just ahead on this episode of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. We'll start off with a quick look at politics. The U.S., Canada, and Mexico have agreed on updates to the North American Free Trade Agreement. Assuming it's ratified by the U.S. Congress, Canada's Parliament, and Mexico's Congress, what's now being called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement will govern the $1.2 trillion in annual trade between the three countries. We won't get into all of the potential winners and losers from the USMCA deal, but it does not mean the end of the current tariffs on American-made whiskies imposed by Canada and Mexico this summer. While USMCA treats whiskies as generally tariff-free, just as NAFTA did, those tariffs are punitive tariffs intended to retaliate for the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum imported from Canada and Mexico, and those tariffs on whiskies will remain in place until that issue gets worked out. Meanwhile, Ireland's controversial public health bill has cleared all but one final step towards restricting alcohol sales. The Dáil passed it Wednesday night, and a final vote in the Seanad is expected soon. It includes minimum pricing for alcohol sales similar to Scotland's scheme, along with restrictions on advertising and retail displays, and the most controversial element, large health warning labels on all alcohol products. Rural lawmakers tried to amend the bill to allow local distilleries more freedom to advertise their visitors' centers, but were defeated overwhelmingly. Irish Prime Minister, or Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, introduced the bill 3 years ago when he was the country's health minister. One proposed amendment by supporters of the bill failed to gain enough support. It would have phased out alcohol sponsorship in sports. Critics said it would keep local bars and restaurants from sponsoring their town's sports clubs. That proposal could come back as part of a built-in review of the bill's impact within the next 3 years. Turning now to the auction block, Wednesday's auction of rare whiskies at Bonham's in Edinburgh saw the world record for a single bottle of whiskey sold at auction fall for the third time this year. Bottle number 5 out of 12 of the Macallan 1926 60-year-old single malt with a label designed by Italian artist Valerio Adami, brought a winning bid of $1,107,663, with all premiums included. That broke the record set back in May by bottle number 2 of the Adami edition at Bonhams in Hong Kong by about $6,000, which broke the previous record set earlier that day at the same auction by a bottle of the Sir Peter Blake edition. Just for clarification, after the Macallan's owners bottled that 1926 Macallan back in 1986, they commissioned Adami and Blake to design special labels for 12 bottles each to be used as corporate gifts. The other 16 bottles went into the Macallan's Fine and Rare collection for sale to the public. Now, that new world record may not last long enough to be certified by Guinness World Records. That's because another Blake bottle will go on the block this Friday at Sotheby's in New York City. And if that one doesn't break the record, well, Christie's has one of those other 16 bottles in its November auction of wines and whiskies in London. It's a one-of-a-kind bottle with a hand-painted label by Irish artist Michael Dillon that was last seen in 1999 when it was sold to its current owner at Fortnum & Mason in London. In other news, there's been another executive suite shakeup in the whiskey industry. Beam Suntory CEO Matt Shattuck announced his plans to step aside next April, 10 years after he became CEO of what was then the Beam Global Spirits and Wine Unit of Fortune Brands. He led Beam's transition from the breakup of Fortune Brands to a standalone company in 2011, then through its acquisition by Suntory in 2014. Shattuck will remain on the Beam Suntory board as its non-executive chairman after his departure. He'll be succeeded by current North American president Albert Bellotti. Shattuck was inducted into the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame last month for his contributions to the state's bourbon industry. Ironically, his predecessor, Tom Flacco, also announced his departure 10 years ago, just weeks after he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. Amrut has quietly been putting the finishing touches on an expansion of its distillery in Bangalore, India. It'll triple Amrut's current capacity when it comes online next month, according to Amrut's Ashok Chokalingam.
We built up a new distillery just next to where we are. Essentially what we have done is we had added 4 more stills. Currently we have 2, so that means we are going to have 6 stills in total, 3 wash and 3 spread. So we are increasing the production from 300,000 liters of alcohol per annum to almost 900,000 to 1 million liters.
And we won't see the results of that for 5 or so years on the market, but this is going to help you meet the demand long term, right?
That's right. So obviously there is no shortcut for maturation. I guess it's going to be like 4 years for us before we can see the whiskey.
Were you surprised by the need to have to increase the capacity? I know you've been trying to deal with a global demand for Amrut that you can't meet, right?
It's really heartening. I mean, all my team work together, and today we are in a situation what every single malt distillery wanted to do. Every drop of the single malt that we produce is bottled and sold as a single malt whiskey. So we have achieved an optimum level of sales in terms of whatever that is available is bottled and sold as a single malt. We can't even touch 1 liter of our new make spread to use it elsewhere. So now, obvious next step is to basically expand. So we don't want to be going crazy in terms of very big expansion. I think 300,000 liters to 900,000 liters is reasonable. Obviously, the next task is going to be convert that as a case goods and sell it as a single malt. That's a bigger problem for it's a good challenge for my sales force.
Ashok Chokalingam wrapped up his North American tour this week to unveil the new Amrut Madeira cask. It replaces the current Porta Nova and intermediate sherry cask Amruts, which were facing supply shortages. They are not completely gone, though. Both will live on in modified versions as exclusives at Dubai duty-free. While the whiskey from the distillery expansion matures, The world will get 3 new versions of Amrut's Greedy Angels in 2019, including 2 peated versions. Kadambam will also return in 2019, and the U.S. will be getting 3 exclusive single-cask Amruts annually, starting next year as well. And finally, Amrut Spectrum returns with a new bottling in 2020. By the way, my tasting notes for that new Madeira cask Amrut are available at whiskycast.com. We have a bunch of new whiskeys to talk about, and let's start off with a matching pair from Gordon and MacPhail, which relaunched its private collection range this week as part of the Urquhart family-owned company's revamp of its 5 core ranges. Identical twin brothers Stuart and Richard Urquhart each selected a single cask of Longmorn, filled back in 1961, and the 2 57-year-old bottlings are being sold as a set. Only 97 sets will be available at a recommended retail sales price of £30,000. That's around $39,360 each. I did receive samples this week of both, and I'll share my tasting notes for them later on. The oldest ever release from Chivas is even more rare. Just 4 bottles of a 50-year-old blend have been created as part of the new partnership between Chivas and football's Manchester United. Only 1 bottle will be available to the public. It'll be sold in a Sotheby's online auction next month, with all proceeds going to the Manchester United Foundation. Bottle number 1 will be given to one of the club's biggest fans, to be determined in a competition with details available on the club's social media feeds. The 3rd bottle will be on display at the club's museum and will be sold at the end of the season during a charity gala with proceeds going to the club's foundation, while the final bottle will go on display at Strathisla Distillery. Online retailer Decanta specializes in Japanese whiskeys, but is now offering one of its first single malts from outside of Japan. It has worked with Taiwan's Kavalan on an exclusive Solist Vinho Barrique single cask bottling. Just 195 bottles of the cask-strength single malt are available at around $400 each. Woodford Reserve unveiled 3 new bourbons this week. There are 2 releases in this year's Masters collection. American Select Oak was matured in Ozark Select Oak casks, while the Oat Grain Edition replaces some of the rye in the usual Woodford Reserve mash bill with oats for a slightly softer, more Irish whiskey-like flavor. Both will sell for around $130 a bottle. The Oat Grain Edition will be available only in the U.S., while the American Select Oak will be sold internationally and in select U.S. markets. By the way, this is not the first time that the Masters Collection series has had 2 whiskeys in the same year. Back in 2013, Woodford Reserve released a pair of single malts matured in new and used barrels as part of the series. And during this week's travel retail show in Cannes, France, Woodford also unveiled what may well be one of the most expensive American whiskeys yet. The Woodford Reserve Baccarat edition will go on sale next May for $1,500 a bottle. And as you might guess from the name, it comes in a Baccarat crystal decanter and was finished in XO cognac casks. The arrival of October usually brings a new edition of Middleton Very Rare from Irish distillers, and master distiller Brian Nation did not leave us hanging this week. The 35th annual release of Middleton Very Rare is a blend of single pot still and single grain whiskeys matured for between 12 and 28 years in ex-bourbon casks. It'll sell for €180, that's around $207 a bottle, and will be available in the U.S., Ireland, the UK, and other select markets. And, of course, the arrival of October means winter is coming. Diageo officially unveiled its Game of Thrones collection of whiskeys this weekend at New York City's Comic-Con. White Walker by Johnny Walker uses Kleinlich and Cardew single malts as the heart of its blend, which was formulated to be served ice cold. It's available now for around $36 a bottle. There are also 8 special single malts, each one with a tie-in to one of the houses of Westeros in Game of Thrones, along with the Night's Watch. Now, the Night's Watch edition is an Oban Little Bay Reserve, and there are also malts from Cardew, Glendullen, Dalwhinnie, Talisker, Royal Lochnagar, Clynelish, and Lagavulin. That one is a 9-year-old named for House Lannister, and with a recommended retail price of $65 a bottle, is the most expensive in the lineup. The malts will go on sale next month, while the final season of Game of Thrones is expected to premiere sometime next year. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. The Khaleesi may have her dragons, but only Highland Park has the Dragon Legend. It shows off the richer and smokier side of Highland Park. Like the dragons, you won't find the Dragon Legend everywhere, but the quest for it will reward you in the end. Find out more about the entire Highland Park range at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. Tickets are still available for Whiskey Live Chicago this coming Thursday night, October 11th. The Craft Spirits Fest is on the 13th in Miami, along with the Balcones Distilling 10th Anniversary Party in Waco, Texas. And Whiskey Live Taipei is October 13th and 14th in Taiwan's capital city. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society's U.S. chapter kicks off a series of 35th anniversary preview tastings on the 15th in New York City, followed by Chicago on the 17th and Los Angeles on the 19th. Halloween is coming up soon, and Tomatin will host its annual Fright Night tours on October 26th at the Distillery in Tomatin, Scotland. Buffalo Trace will have its annual Disturbia at the Distillery Halloween celebration on the 26th and 27th in Frankfort, Kentucky. Whiskey Live Johannesburg is October 31st and November 1st in South Africa. The Oslo Whiskey Festival is on November 2nd and 3rd in Norway. And Lawrenceburg, Indiana hosts the Whiskey City Festival November 3rd. Right now, we have 186 different events on our searchable calendar at WhiskyCast.com. Just click on the search button to find events near you or wherever you may be traveling soon. And if you have a tasting, festival, or other whiskey-related event coming up, just use the contact form at WhiskyCast.com to let us know about it. We'll add it to the list.
This is whiskey. Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey. From this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. This is what they sound like.
Because you're a cheeky wee blighter.
Dance like. Aye, like that. This is what they do all day. Building the great character of Johnny Walker Black Label. Aging in oak for 12 long years.
Thanks. Oh, it's gorgeous there.
What is character? It's giving a damn.
You're alright, lassie.
Which looks like this, as much as this. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes.
Got the bloody game on the telly, Alan.
A whiskey as bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Cut.
Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whiskey. 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. I was in Lawrenceburg, Indiana this week to tour the MGP Distillery as part of a press trip organized by MGP. The distillery itself dates back to 1847, when George Ross opened the original Rossville Distillery on the banks of Tanner's Creek, which flows into the nearby Ohio River. The distillery was one of the few allowed to stay open during Prohibition, making whiskey for so-called medicinal use. But it really hit its stride after Prohibition, when Seagrams bought the place and sunk millions of dollars into upgrades during the 50s and 60s. In 1972, a young man by the name of Larry Ebersold joined Seagrams. and he wound up running the distillery as its master distiller years later. He stuck it out through the decline and breakup of the Seagram's empire, when the distillery wound up in Pernod Ricard's hands, while many of the brands it made whiskey for at the time went to Diageo and other owners. Pernod Ricard almost closed it down in 2008, but wound up selling it to CL Financial, the Trinidad and Tobago-based conglomerate that also owned Angostura Rum and Scotland's Burn Stewart distillers. But when CL Financial crashed and burned shortly after that deal, the distillery was in jeopardy of closing yet again, and Larry Ebersold retired in 2010, about a year before Kansas-based MGP stepped in to buy the place. Since then, Larry has been consulting with startup distilleries, including Sagamore Spirit in Baltimore, where President Brian Tracy refers to him as the Godfather of Rye, and New Riff Distillery, located just a few miles up the Ohio River in Newport, Kentucky. New Riff brought its first bottled-in-bond bourbon and Larry Ebersold to a launch party recently in New York City, and that's where Larry and I sat down to talk.
Tell me about the plant back when it was Seagram's. We now know it today as MGP, but it was the same facility but completely different operation at the time, right?
Absolutely. We were able to make straight whiskeys, rye, bourbons, corn whiskey. We had also made gin, the Seagram's gin. We made Burnett's gin. And we also made light whiskey, which is a category of whiskey. And we made grain-neutral spirits. So we had the whole gamut, and we ran about 100 to 110,000 proof gallons a day of alcohol.
And that was a massive operation even at the time, right?
Yes, it was.
What did all that go into? I know it went into, a lot of it went into Seagram 7, right?
Seagram 7, and in later years it went into Crown Royal and some into VO.
Wait a second, it went into Crown Royal? I thought that was all Canadian whiskey.
Well, the interesting thing about Canadian whiskey, you're allowed 9.5% that can be flavors. And the company decided that those flavors should be the whiskey coming from other locations like Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and at the time, Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, Four Roses.
I don't think anybody realizes, it's not the case now because it's all distilled in Gimli, Manitoba, but I don't think anybody realized that Crown Royal back in the day had whiskey from Indiana and Kentucky in it.
Well, it was later in the years. It wasn't at the beginning because Seagram's had all of those different plants in Canada. And as the market turned, and it actually started turning when I started in 1972, they started closing plants both in Canada and also in the U.S. And when they finally closed the final plant that they had in Canada, other than Gimli, which was Waterloo, they realized that all of their good flavors, and in Canada they called them flavorings, which were straight whiskeys, they didn't have a library of it anymore. So that's when they expanded out and started coming to people like Lawrenceburg, Indiana, part of the family, and used that 9.5% to put the American whiskey in it.
The infamous Canadian loophole, right?
The loophole, exactly.
And at the time, Seagram's 7 was probably the biggest whiskey of its time, or Seagram's VO, right?
Well, Seagram's 7 was selling on an average 7 million cases a year. And in fact, they had the 300 millionth case celebration back in the very early 80s, if I remember correctly. It might have been in the late 70s. And then it started to decline as taste changed.
Now, we all know the story of the Seagram's breakup when it was became part of Allied Demec, and that all got broken up. What prompted you to finally call it quits at the distillery in Lawrenceburg?
I think turning 60 is what kind of pushed me to the end. But I was actually stayed 5 years longer than I wanted to, helping them out, helping Pernod out. And I was actually working with Wild Turkey to do their expansion, their new plant. I was deeply involved with the layout of the plant, the startup of the plant. When I actually did my first consulting in 2010 was when they were starting that plant up. So I did that, and then Ken and Jay came after me later in that year.
and New Riff was born around that time, and you've been working with those guys ever since, right?
That's who I'm referring to, Ken and Jay Erisman. They came after me right at the beginning of 2010 when they had this idea. So I started. This is my first consulting job, was New Riff.
Now, you, if I remember right, helped them source that first original OKI whiskey, Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana stuff that they were bottling back in the early days, right?
Well, if I remember it correctly, they had actually already agreed to buy that whiskey. And I believe they asked the plant manager at the time, who happens to be a friend of mine I play golf with all the time, is there anybody out there that could maybe help us build a distillery? And he referred me. And that's when they called me up, and I started working with them.
And it's been a long road downhill ever since, right?
Well, something like that.
Because that was the start of a whole consulting career that got you into Sagamore Spirit in Baltimore and other places too, right?
Many other places. Sometimes it's not from the building of a distillery from the ground up. Sometimes it's going in to help the people with their system to maybe straighten it out a little bit or improve it. And I've worked with several. But there's been 4 or 5 that I've worked on from the ground up.
Such as? Let's name some names here.
Sagamore, since you brought it up, is one of them. And all these projects take 4 years at least. And I know Sagamore was, and so was New Riff, running 3.5, 4 years.
What do you tell somebody who's got a boatload of money, wants to build a distillery, and they come to you, want to hire you as their consultant? What's the first thing you tell them?
I usually tell them I think they're nuts. But that's because I've spent my career working it and I know how difficult it is. And then after we get past that, we'll sit down and talk about it. Oftentimes they don't really want to work with me, as it turns out, because they decide to go a different way. But
because they can't handle the truth, right?
They can't handle the truth. I have talked people out of doing it, but not intentionally. I want them to know the truth before they get into it.
This is not the easiest business in the world to make money in, is it?
No, it's not. No, it's not. The biggest problem you have is that cash flow at the beginning. Now, to Ken's credit, with New Riff, he told me when I first talked to him, I'm not going to release any bourbon until it's 4 years old. Now, I might have been a little skeptical at the beginning, but he held true to that. And so his whiskey tastes extremely good right now, but it's all 4 years old and going forward.
Are you surprised by the way the whiskey business has sort of exploded in terms of craft distilling and all these little distilleries popping up over the last few years?
I am surprised, I guess, again, coming from a large place. You know, going back to my very first year in the business is when the bourbon industry really took the downturn. And for my entire career, so from 1972 until 2008 or 9, right before I retired, Seagram's closed plants in the first couple of years that I was employed by them. I mean, they went from 5 in Kentucky down to none, well, 4 Roses to 1 in Indiana, and only 1 in Baltimore. And then they finally closed the Baltimore plant in 83, the relay plant. And the whole business had been sliding until right at the end of my career when I'd taken that dip and going straight up.
So I got to ask, since you worked with Seagram's back in the day and did a lot of work around 4 Roses, give me your best Jim Rutledge story.
Well, we had something called a product knowledge seminar, and we would train marketing and salespeople. And we ran about 800 sales and marketing people through our plant in Indiana. Well, they also started one for the Japanese, since 4 Roses was mainly selling to Japan. Jim couldn't make one of them, so they brought me in to do his part in the product knowledge seminar. Well, Jim came in for the party afterwards, so we were on a stern wheel boat on the Kentucky River with all the Japanese that attended that particular PKS session. And as it turns out, we ended up singing, Jim and I, while everybody else was eating dinner. And needless to say, singing, not eating, and drinking was a really bad combination for some of us.
What were you singing?
Anything they played. We were doing karaoke. And so anything they put on, we sang it.
I take it there's no video of this anywhere.
Thank God, no.
What's your best memory from the whiskey business?
Wow.
Besides that.
You know, I don't know that I can answer that. There are so many great memories. Most of them kind of fell around some really great parties that I was involved with back in the early days, not so much at the end, but in the early days. But it's just the best thing about it was being able to produce really good whiskey. Now that I was able to drink what I made has probably been the biggest thrill I've ever had, because when OKI came out and I started working with them, I was now able to drink the best bourbon that I think was out there, which was made in Indiana, where I could never get it before because it was always blended away. So probably in the last several years when I've been able to drink bourbon that was made under my supervision in all the years that I worked.
You never got to drink it until then?
No, because all we did was we tasted it, we made the components, and it got blended away. There was never a product that came out that was strictly our bourbon, whether it was high rye, the lower rye bourbon, or rye whiskey. It wasn't out there to be consumed. Now, I tasted a lot of it in the lab, but never had an opportunity to drink it.
You got a few bottles stashed away now?
I've got a lot of different things stashed away that came out of the place. When they closed it, the plant, when it got sold, they cleaned out the lab. And being friends with the quality manager, there were several samples that they had to give them to somebody, and I volunteered to take them.
Because I think a lot of people forget, Pernod Ricard actually closed the place. They were going to shut it down for good until somebody from Trinidad came in and bought it, I think.
Exactly, when Angostura came in and bought it from them, but they were going to shut it down. I was involved with selling the inventory that they had, the whiskey inventory. So I was able to sell all that stuff, but I was never able to drink it until the smaller distilleries bought it up and used it to improve their cash flow until they had their own come online, like Ken.
It's fun to notice that Pernod Ricard both closed the Lawrenceburg distillery and they sold off Wild Turkey just as the new place opened up. And all of a sudden, they missed the heart of the bourbon renaissance.
And they've been kicking themselves ever since, because I never understood it. I know they didn't like to carry a lot of debt, and they had just bought Absolute, and that's how Wild Turkey got sold. So I even asked them before, while I was selling these 50,000 barrels, it's actually belonged to Australia. They ended up on the market, but I had other inventory I was selling. I said, "Are you guys sure you want to do this?" And they said, "Oh, absolutely." So they did, got rid of Wild Turkey, and now they're very sorry.
I did ask Alexander Ricard, the CEO of Pernod Ricard, about this about a year and a half ago, and it was before he became CEO. But he did tell me that he didn't have any regrets because they had to sell it to pay for Absolute vodka. But I still got a feeling in his heart of hearts, if he had a time machine, he'd go back and fix that.
I think you're right. I totally agree.
So where's the best whiskey made, the best bourbon made? Is it made in Indiana or in Kentucky?
Now, I'm a little biased, but I think it was made in the Lawrenceburg, Indiana plant. But I'm a little biased. You have to understand that.
And thanks to Larry Ebersold for spending some time with us on WhiskyCast In-Depth. Once again, we sat down for that interview at New Riff Distillery's launch party in New York City, and you'll find my tasting notes for the New Riff bourbon at the WhiskyCast website. They're also working on a New Riff Rye Whiskey that'll be coming out in the next month or so. And, by the way, if anyone does happen to have video of Larry and Jim Rutledge from that karaoke night, get in touch with us. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Isla single malt. Look for the classic Lagavulin 16-year-old, the Distiller's Edition. the Throwback 8-year-old, and coming soon to a whiskey shop near you, this year's edition of the Cask Strength Lagavulin 12-year-old. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Of course, MGP has started creating its own whiskey brands to go alongside the whiskeys it distills for other companies. Last November, MGP released the first edition of its George Remus Repeal Reserve Bourbon as an annual release around the November 13th birthday of George Remus, known as the King of the Bootleggers. And it is worth noting that some of the whiskey Remus sold illegally during Prohibition came from that distillery. This year's Repeal Reserve edition is coming out soon, but I had a chance to taste it this week at the distillery. The 2018 edition comes from older 11 and 12-year-old bourbons distilled at MGP by Larry Ebersold, and it's bottled at 50% ABV, up from last year's 47%. The nose is gentle and soft with subtle spices, honey, vanilla, and cocoa notes. The taste is slightly dry with a good build-up of peppercorns and allspice that fades slowly to reveal touches of dark chocolate, honey, vanilla, and dried fruits. The spices last on the tongue through the finish with a slightly dry mouthfeel and hints of caramel and dark chocolate in the background. The extra bottling strength makes a difference in this year's edition, and I'm scoring the George Remus Repeal Reserve 2018 edition a 93. You'll find my tasting notes for the 2017 edition at whiskycast.com. As we mentioned during the interview, Larry Ebersold has been working with Sagamore Spirit Distillery in Baltimore, which is also sourcing rye whiskey from MGP, while its own whiskey is maturing. Sagamore Spirit has just released a new port finish rye using port wine casks from both Portugal and Maryland. It's bottled at 50.5% ABV, and the nose is fruity with notes of peaches, apricots, gentle spices, and just a hint of honey. The taste has good spices with clove, cinnamon, and allspice, with a nice balance of peaches, apricots, and a hint of plums, and notes of honey and toffee in the background. The finish is long with gently fading spices, honey, peaches, and just a hint of orange marmalade. I'm scoring the Sagamore Spirit Rye Port Finish a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, family-owned from the start, and proud to work with other family-owned companies on the Grain to Glass project. They're working with Beck's Hybrid and Peterson Farms to find unique seeds, grow them, and then distill them into a special whiskey. Follow the project at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. I'm working my way now through the samples of this year's Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, starting with the 2018 edition of the Eagle Rare 17-year-old bourbon. This one has the biggest change for 2018, since it's bottled at 50.5% ABV, or 101 proof, up from the 45% ABV bottling strength in previous years. The nose has notes of caramel, vanilla, charred oak, and touches of pepper, allspice, and brown sugar. The taste has a great flavor with a good balance of spices and sweetness. White pepper, allspice, and a hint of ginger root are complemented nicely by caramel, vanilla, brown sugar, and a hint of honey with a slight touch of mint. The finish is long with spicy notes that fade away slowly, with bits of honey, brown sugar, and caramel in the background. The higher bottling strength does make a difference. I'm scoring the 2018 Eagle Rare 17-year-old a 92. And let's wrap up with a twofer. The twin 1961 Longmorn bottlings from Gordon and MacPhail's private collection. I received samples a few days ago of the 57-year-old casks selected by brothers Stuart and Richard Urquhart. Stuart selected cask number 512, an American Oak ex-sherry cask that was bottled at 40.8% ABV. The nose is sweet and fruity with fresh berries, ground vanilla, brown sugar, and gentle spices. The taste has a nice balance of spices and fruitiness with baking spices, black cherries, licorice, and oak tannins. The finish is long and oaky with lingering spices and just a hint of licorice. Now, Richard selected cask number 508. It's a European oak ex-sherry cask that was bottled at 45% ABV. The nose on this one is aromatic and woody with touches of cedar and sandalwood, along with brandy, plums, and honey. The taste is thick, chewy, and tart with lemon zest, orange marmalade, soft spices, oak tannins, and dark chocolate. The finish is long, oaky, and slightly dry. Which one is better? It's hard to say. Like identical twins, they have a lot in common with just a few subtle differences. So I'm scoring both 1961 Longmorns from the Gordon and MacPhail Private Collection a 90. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'm adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,300 different whiskeys. You'll find it at whiskeycast.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. I mentioned on social media that it's becoming rare to taste whiskeys older than I am these days. And that led to this tweet on those Gordon and MacPhail Longmorns from Irish Whiskey Barry at Irish Whiskey BC on Twitter. Do you count time in barrel and bottle to compare to your age? I've been trying to figure the same thing out. Well, I count time the same way age statements work, from when a whiskey was distilled to when it's bottled. It doesn't count if it was distilled a couple of generations ago, but has been in the bottle for a long time. And that's along the lines of the whiskey in this email from Rob that came in the other day. I have a bottle of 18-year-old Gibson's with a 1961 tax seal on it. That means it was laid down in 1943, unopened, always kept in the dark. Would it be worth anything? If so, how would I check its value? Well, that's one area where I don't usually go into. I'm not a good judge of valuing older whiskeys, so I told Rob to check in with Joe Hyman at Skinner Auctions. He's a pretty good judge of the value of those vintage whiskeys. And speaking of the value of whiskeys, Chris Farrell at ChrisF74 on Twitter asked about the new Ardbeg 20-something 22-year-old that I gave my tasting notes for last time around. Question is it worth the 440 pounds Ardbeg are charging for it? Once again, Chris, that is not a question I can answer for you. Only you can decide whether a whiskey is worth the price you're being asked to pay for it. All I can say is that I have never paid that much money for a bottle of whiskey. I asked a question on Twitter earlier this week as the Nobel Prizes were being announced in Sweden. And, of course, there is no Nobel Prize for whiskey, but damn it, there should be. And if there were, who should receive it this year? We had a lot of nominees. Among those mentioned more than once, Jimmy Russell, Jim McEwen, and Dr. Don Livermore. And all of the nominees were solid suggestions, except for one from Scott Rittenbaugh at Love Them Stillers on Twitter, with this presumably tongue-in-cheek nomination. Donald Trump, because his tariffs somehow managed to bring together the entire whiskey industry for that summit in Louisville, face with tears of joy emoji and whiskey emoji. Thanks, Scott. I think. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on the usual social media hangouts. Look for WhiskyCast on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. And our email address is comments@whiskeycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the science, history, and other stuff that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. It's a given that the alcoholic strength of maturing whiskey increases in most bourbon warehouses, while it falls in Scotland, Ireland, and other cooler climates. And that's said to be because of the climate, right? That's why we get some whoppers bottled in the mid-60% ABV range or higher, even though U.S. law requires that new-make whiskey be filled into a barrel at no more than 62.5% ABV. Now, if you were listening carefully, remember that I just said the word most. That's because it's not as simple as just the climate. The type of warehouse also makes a difference. When I was at MGP in Lawrenceburg, Indiana this week, they mentioned that their whiskeys rarely ever gain strength during maturation. Their warehouses are these great big giant buildings as large as those found just a few miles south in Kentucky, but they're also made out of brick and concrete. David Whitmer is one of the current master distillers at MGP, and I asked him for an explanation.
So, a hot and dry warehouse will cause the proof to go up, and a cooler and more humid warehouse will cause the proof to go down. And that all has to do with alcohol versus water loss through the barrel. So hot and dry, more water escapes, and so the proof goes up. And when it's cooler and more humid, more alcohol than water escapes, and so the proof goes down.
But when you have warehouses that are made out of brick and concrete, as opposed to rick houses that are made out of wood and then tin sheets on the side and a real thin tin roof, and try to say that 3 times real fast after a few drinks, that really is where the impact comes, because you don't have the same barrel proof issues that the guys within 30 minutes of here do, right?
Right. So it's not about geography or climate. It's all about warehouse construction or rickhouse construction. So the fact that the MGP warehouses are brick and can retain both the coolness and the humidity, again, causes more alcohol loss. So as I said to you today, our joke at our warehouses is the angels are happier because there's more alcohol for them to absorb.
And they retain heat in the wintertime too, right? So it keeps it more even year-round.
Yeah, there is some fluctuation. Generally, any warehouse that you walk in, it's about a 3-month lag, so kind of it never gets hot. Like, you don't get summertime heat in any of the warehouses. But you could walk in January, and it would actually be warmer. Just like as you walk in here in October, it's going to be still warm, but it's going to be starting to get a little cooler. And you really don't feel like the summer heat in the warehouse until about now or October, November.
Mm-hmm. And you guys aren't the only ones who do this. Stitzel-Weller has a few warehouses like this over in Louisville, and there are other distilleries around Kentucky that have the brick style of warehouse, but just they don't talk about it as much.
I suppose they don't, because the majority of them are, the traditional tin-clad rack house that people can see from the street, and that's what people associate with. But you're right, there are several other brick warehouses, but a lot of brick warehouses didn't survive, and they were certainly in Lawrenceburg, they were the thing, but for all the distilleries that really encompass all of our campus right now, and we really like them,
But when you build new ones in the future, you're going to have to build more traditional tin style, right?
Traditional in that they aren't brick, but to match the same kind of aging profile, they will not be a very high tin structure. They're a low profile tin with some insulation, and so that's really to mimic the top floors of our brick warehouses.
And those are going to be almost sort of like the dunnage warehouses over in Scotland in a lot of ways, I would think.
In a lot of ways, you were right, yep. Mm-hmm.
Thanks to MGP Master Distiller David Whitmer for helping us solve this riddle on Behind the Label. And full disclosure, while I was MGP's guest in Lawrenceburg this week, full editorial control over this segment remains with WhiskyCast. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, Just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and the WhiskyCast HD videos, along with the latest whiskey news, events, photos, and a whole lot more. I hope you'll take a minute this week and leave a review or a rating for WhiskyCast on your favorite podcast app. Those ratings really do matter because they help other whiskey lovers discover WhiskyCast when they're looking for podcasts. Our cask strength conversation continues all week long on social media. Look for us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. Or if you're not the social media type, you can always email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com, and we'd love to hear from you.
This is whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you twice each week from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.